Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give it 1 minute to let other people sign on and we'll begin shortly. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Libby Sobic, the Director of Education Policy, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Will Flanders, who will be presenting information on our annual Apples to Apples report. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, I just wanted to take a brief moment and introduce our organization. We are a nonprofit 501c3 group located in Milwaukee. We've been around for over 10 years now, and we do both litigation and legal services, as well as really comprehensive and timely research reports. Will Flanders is our Director of Research, and he really leads our team on putting out thought-provoking and interesting research in a variety of fields, but K-12 education continues to be a main priority. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. This presentation is being recorded, and we ask any questions be submitted at the bottom of your screen via the Q&A chat. We are holding some time at the end, but we are happy to answer questions as you raise them. I'll be helping Will monitor the Q&A chat while we continue to go through. Last but not least, I just wanted to set the table about why this presentation and this report is more important and informative today than ever. We know that the conversation around education and how we rate and value the education of our children has been a national discussion, and one that has not missed our Wisconsin communities. So as we talk about educational options and how we can really determine what our kids are learning and how well they're learning, what really comes down to is the quality of the data and the quality of the analysis. My colleague Will has done this annual report to really help parents and school board members and teachers and the public understand what our state data is telling us, and does an analysis to really make it easier to compare students in what we call an apples to apples manner, putting them on an equal foothold. So with that, I'm happy to pass it over to my colleague, Will Flanders.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Libby, and thanks to everyone again for joining us today. So I think we'll begin by just describing and discussing why this report is actually needed. Libby kind of went over that a little bit, but what we know, and now more so than ever, the state report card in its current form has become somewhat unusable. So I just put a screenshot on the right-hand side of the screen here of the results for Milwaukee. Milwaukee received an overall score of 58 on the state report card on a 100-point scale. That's pretty low, but what they did this year is that the DPI moved the bar so that became a score that meets expectations. They sort of shifted the standards down so that a district like Milwaukee falls into the meet expectations. Curiously, they shifted it just enough for Milwaukee to cross over the threshold. But it's not just Milwaukee that has issues. We have low proficiency statewide, and the state report card really doesn't do a very good job in sort of describing where schools are doing well and where they aren't. We need some other metrics to do that. The second reason that we need this report is that a surface level analysis really doesn't tell us everything we need to know. What we know in the state and really across the country is that students come to school with varying levels of experience. They come to school with varying levels of pre-existing knowledge. And if we're going to do a fair assessment of schools, we need to account for that. You know, the report card attempts to do that with growth, but even proficiency in determining which schools are doing a good job, we really need to account for those demographic and school type factors in order to make what we call an apples to apples comparison of schools. Just wanted to note here as well that we have a dashboard. Know your school, know my school or know your school, Libby. Now I'm messing up now.
Know my school WI.
Know my school WI. You can view all of the school data for the state as a whole. We have every district in the state. You can do sort of a comparison over time of where spending has gone per student, and then you can look at proficiency levels, as well as enrollment. What we have here is the state overall picture, but there's a drop-down menu in the upper left corner where you can choose every district in the state. I think it's important to also note this is just DPI data. This isn't data that we've done any sort of adjustment to. So you can start with this, and then you can sort of use the apples to apples paper, which is available on our website, as sort of a comparison to see what happens when we make those proper adjustments and where we think some of the state level data is a bit lacking. But just wanted to note that resource is out there. We've had a good reception so far from folks all over the state from it, and we'll hopefully continue to update that as new data comes out in years to come. So again, what is the apples to apples report? I kind of mentioned this on the earlier slide, but we do need to recognize where kids come from. And a number of the key factors that we consider in this report are economic status. We'll discuss in the report here how dramatic the impact of student income status is on proficiency levels. Obviously, that's unfortunate. We'd like to see that not matter, but both in Wisconsin and around the country, it's a huge factor. And it's especially important that we consider these factors when we're looking at comparisons to our state's private school choice and charter school programs. These programs in Milwaukee are open to kids, Milwaukee and Racine are open to kids up to 300% of the federal poverty limit. Outstate in the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program, they're open to students at 220% of the federal poverty limit. So if we just take the state level data and say, look, proficiency is lower in the choice program than it is in the state as a whole, well, we're not sort of accounting for what we know about the economic status effects and things of that nature, but again, where kids come into school. And it's also important for our public schools. Obviously, public schools vary in the level of students who have these characteristics as well, that unfortunately do tend to affect proficiency. This is the fourth time we've done this report. We did skip 2020, obviously, because there was no data. We'll talk here about the implications of COVID and what that's done to our analysis here going forward as well. And then we're back on it now that there's state testing data. The data we're analyzing here, by the way, is from the 2020-21 school year. We'll have new data coming out next fall that'll allow us to go through this cycle again and do next year's report. So what are the educational options in Wisconsin? I think it's important to start just, for folks who may have varying levels of knowledge on this topic with an overview. We have over 400 traditional public school districts in the state. These are, some are very small with only maybe one high school, one grade school, and somewhat unique to Wisconsin, though there are other states that have this. We have some districts that aren't even K through 12. We have K through 8 districts and high school districts as well. We've done in the past some reports that say this level of, this leads to a lot of overhead and level of bureaucracy that might be a little bit of a negative force, but that's for another discussion. We also have the 4 parental choice programs. So in addition to the 3 I mentioned before, the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program, Milwaukee and Racine, we also have the Special Needs Scholarship Program. We have 3 types of charter schools in the state, and we won't go into a lot of depth here about what they are. I think that's a whole discussion on its own as well. But suffice it to say, we have independent charters, which are charters that are run by entities other than local school districts. So these are, the UW system, the city of Milwaukee, and a few other authorizers throughout the state. And then we have district charters, which are charters that are authorized by school districts. There's an additional level of nuance with those. Some are very closely tied to the school district. Those are called instrumentalities. And some are given more independence from the school district. Those are called non-instrumentalities. Unfortunately, we need to update our data set to determine by looking at contracts, which of those 2 district charters, or excuse me, what type of charter each one is within the district setting. So we don't have that level of depth of data in this year's report. We'll also mention the homeschooling program is another large, there are a large number of students in the state that take advantage of that program as well. What you can see on the right-hand side of the screen here is the growth and enrollment of the 3 state choice programs other than SNSP, the 4th program, over the last few years, going back to 2010. You can see the Milwaukee program has grown a bit, but also the WPCP has undergone a more substantial growth in recent years. So what schools are required to report proficiency on the state report card? I think this is a unique feature of Wisconsin that's important to highlight. Some states that have school choice programs don't require their schools to participate in the state exam. You talk to some folks that, in the choice sector, and they think maybe this is a detriment. They think that having to take these state-run tests kind of leads to less differentiation ability from public schools because you're kind of having to teach the same material as the public schools. But what it does allow us to do is do these analyses. And so I'm sympathetic to the need for data here, although I can certainly see the other side as well, that maybe we shouldn't be requiring participation. But in addition to public schools, our charter school students take the state exam, as well as private schools that are participating in the state program, or in the state's programs. All of the programs in the state have students that are participating. We'll discuss some opt-outs further on here. So I mentioned that we would discuss the unique challenges that COVID created in analyzing the data this year. What we saw were tremendous levels, like extremely high levels of student opt-out or student non-participation, I should say, within public schools. So what you can see in the bottom of the screen here is a comparison of the percentage of non-participation in some districts around the state. In Milwaukee, for example, in 2018-19, so the year before COVID, we had 1.5% of students not taking the state exam. But in this year's data, we had 55 or nearly 56% of students not taking the state exam. Similar results in Madison. Last year pre-COVID, it was 5%. Now it's 50%. And you see that in some other districts as well. Green Bay went from 1 to 26. Kenosha went from 0.6 to 24, and down the list. This is primarily a problem in our larger districts in the state, but it's comprehensive enough or pervasive enough that we really do need to account for it in the analyses that we do here. Because what we know is that the students who didn't take the test tended to be lower income students. They tended to be students who might have dragged the numbers down further. I think one important thing to also note here is that when we're talking about proficiency levels on the state exam this year, there were headlines about proficiency under 10% in districts like Milwaukee. One caveat on that data is that all the kids that didn't take the test, this 55% in Milwaukee, are counted as not proficient. So this means that we're likely to see a big increase in proficiency this year just from more kids actually taking the test. And I think it's important to note is, no doubt there'll be messaging or maybe news headlines that simply say, proficiency rate shot up around the state. It's important to note that this is at least somewhat an artifact of much, hopefully closer to normal levels of participation than what we saw this past year. But again, important to note that we did have to account for participation levels in our analyses this year because they're so varying statewide between what we see normally and what we see in our 2020-21 data.
So Flanders, before you move on, I just wanted to flag for everyone, to your point about the DPI, how they accounted for the students, it is really important because it really masks where students are. We actually don't know where over 55% of students in Milwaukee's academic level are at. And when you add up these kids across the state, it's going to be immensely challenging for teachers and school administrators next year to really compare to know if that student didn't take a test during the 2021 school year, how are we going to be able to figure out what their baseline is and moving forward? So I just wanted to double down on that point because I do think it's really important as we all really anxiously look forward to figuring out how to overcome the pandemic challenges in education. This is an issue that's going to haunt us, I think, for the next couple of years.
Absolutely, Libby, a great point. For those kids, remember there was no testing in 2020. They didn't take the test in 2020-21 school year. So they're missing 2 years of data. For 56% of kids in Milwaukee, they haven't had their proficiency measured in 2 years. And I think that is going to absolutely create bigger problems for teachers and the state as a whole moving forward. It's also important to note that when we look statewide, that private schools we're particularly talking about the WPCP, but also Racine in Milwaukee to some extent as well, though much less of an issue in Milwaukee, tend to have a lower participation rate. This is because a lot of the private schools outstate aren't largely voucher schools. There's a small percentage of kids in the school that are using the voucher, and if you're a parent of a kid in that school, taking the state exam when most of the kids in the school don't have to take it, could be a little bit of an uncomfortable situation, sort of identifying someone as being on the voucher. And there might be other reasons that parents would opt their students out as well. They might just not think that it's worthwhile for them to participate. But what this does statewide is it makes this participation issue less of a problem, because really what we saw this year is more similar levels outstate of participation between choice and public school kids. I did see a couple Q&A things. Is there anything worth bringing up here, Libby, at this point?
Yes. So we have one question. Let's take them backwards. So did students have the option of not taking the test in 2021? I don't understand why they didn't take it if state law requires it. That's a really good question. So what our hypothesis is really based on is the state test was mandated, but for districts like Milwaukee, they were still virtual during the testing time period. And so the students to take the exam had to come in person into the school to take the exam. The board test was not waived online. It was requiring an in-person testing. And so, Milwaukee has said publicly that they tried to contact as many families as possible to get their kids to come in, but we know that 55% of the kids didn't show up. That is different than the issue that Will just addressed, where a parent physically signs a form and opts their child out of the test. That is a right that all parents have, public or private. But for this past year, while this test was required, just quite simply, kids just didn't show up to take the test. And then we got another question about requirement to take the state test. All voucher students are required to take the state test. Their parents have the same option that public school parents do, which is to opt their child out of the state exam. And as Will explained, for some of the smaller schools that have much smaller numbers of voucher students, where the state test is not the exam that the school population participates in, you often see higher levels of parents opting their child out of the state exam because it isn't part of the total school culture, and it can be seen as an identifying factor for their child that some parents kind of identify as negative. But whether you're in the Wisconsin program, the Racine program, or the Milwaukee program, and you're on a state voucher, you are required to take the state exam unless your parents actively opt you out of it. And then lastly, so I think we're going to save this question. It's when folks claim low proficiency rates in cities like Milwaukee, are they overstating what the problem is? But I know what you're going to talk about next, Flanders, so I'll let you use that as a jumping point for the next slides.
Good segue to some of the stuff we're discussing further on in the presentation here. So I'll just note here as we move forward that one more thing on participation, not to belabor the point, but we did see higher participation rates in our choice schools in Milwaukee relative to the traditional public schools this year. That actually created some data issues that'll the nerdiest among you may appreciate the way we'll discuss in a few moments here. So this little chart here is sort of the result of that issue. What we usually do is we sort of put all of this data into a regression equation, and without going into the details, essentially what we're trying to see is controlling for all those things like economic status that we mentioned before. Do we see a proficiency advantage for choice and charter schools, or really any sector? Do we see a proficiency advantage for public schools for that matter? But the problem this year was that because private schools in Milwaukee were largely in person and participated at a much higher rate on the state exam, that sort of fully absorbed the effect of private schools. So without going into too much detail, I'm happy to discuss this with anyone offline if they're really interested. We use what's known as a mediation technique, and what we're seeing here is sort of the backwards path to see, is there an effect on proficiency from the choice programs once we account for the fact that the participation plays such a big role. And we indeed found that still is the case. There still was a proficiency advantage for choice schools. So once we account for mediation, so once we account for the sort of fact that there's this backwards path going on, we do see a proficiency advantage of about 4%. It was about 4.6 in math and 4.4 in English language arts in choice and charter school, or excuse me, in choice schools relative to traditional public schools. We saw the same thing for independent charters. This backwards path mediation thing was happening. And in those schools, we saw a proficiency rate of about 2.6% higher in math and ELA, again, after accounting for those factors. We did not see significant mediation for district charters. I'd have to, look into the factor. Maybe Libby's familiar, but I think these schools may have been a little more likely to have been closed, so the participation gap wasn't quite as large. Nonetheless, we did see a proficiency advantage for those schools, just looking at it the sort of normal way, quote unquote, that we've done in past years.
So Flanders, I want to just pause you here for those participating. So when we say things are 4% higher, can you kind of give an example of what we mean by that? Because it's sort of it's not just like a scale on a test, right? It's not someone's getting an A to a B. It means something more complicated than that.
That's right. So the proficiency rates are set by DPI, and maybe that's problematic as well. But we have two categories on the state exam that are meets expectations or exceeds expectations or significantly exceeds expectations. This is the percentage of kids that sort of fall into those upper categories. They're judged by the state to be meeting levels of proficiency. Ostensibly, these levels of proficiency are tied to some national standards as well. And so that's why when Wisconsin adopted those a few years ago, we actually saw a pretty large drop in proficiency because before we had our own system. So this is sort of a national, it's at least tied to a national metric of what it means to be on grade level, essentially, or exceeding grade level. And the choice kids and the charter kids are significantly more likely to reach those levels, though obviously not to a huge level, right? There's this proficiency gap, not gigantic, but significant, and I would argue substantively meaningful as well. A few other things I think are worth noting as we look at the data here, and I didn't put the charts on here, but accounting for student income is tremendously important, because what we see in Milwaukee, as well as we'll see statewide later on here, it's hard to overstate how large the gap in proficiency is between low income and non-low income students in Milwaukee. Essentially, if we had a hypothetical school in Milwaukee with no low income kids, and a hypothetical school, actually, we don't need a hypothetical. There are schools with 100% low income kids. We project a 30% swing in proficiency. So 30% lower proficiency in a school with 100% low income kids. This is, a huge number. It's not necessarily surprising, and it is consistent with what we've seen in the past. There is some evidence that the pandemic has sort of expanded and exacerbated these problems, because low income families were less likely to be able to sort of supplement for when their kids were out of school. But again, with huge numbers of kids not participating, we may not be able to fully see that till next year. Another story we've heard for a long time in Milwaukee that is continued to be shown by this data is a huge achievement gap for African-American students. Even in the model that accounts for income, so we're accounting for income at the same time, we still see a 30% percentage point swing, lower achievement for African-American students relative to other students, and a pretty substantial one for Hispanic students as well at 18%. So again, compared to a Caucasian student or Caucasian students in Milwaukee, proficiency rates are 30% lower. A lot of times we'll say, the sort of income gap explains a lot of the achievement gap. What we're seeing this year is that it doesn't fully explain the achievement gap. The achievement gap exists on two different dimensions here, and obviously is a large problem for the city and the state as a whole going forward, as it has been for a long time. Wisconsin has long been ranked as one of the states with the largest achievement gaps in the country.
So Flanders, I'll repeat the other question then. So when folks say that we have very low proficiency rates in cities like Milwaukee, do you think they're overstating what the problem is?
Yeah, so I think the answer there is the numbers are hard for folks to comprehend, because they're it's just data. But I think we shouldn't understate the extent of the problem. It's a tremendous problem. These gaps are huge, both compared to other states, as well as even other cities that don't quite have the achievement gap that we see in Milwaukee. So no, I don't think we're sort of overstating the problem. The one issue this year is when we talked about the proficiency rates under 10%. Again, we had that data issue. But I think in general, the discussion around the need to improve schools in Milwaukee is not misplaced, because we see this huge gap continually over time.
And then Flanders, one more question. When we say 30%, does that mean 30 percentile points? I think it's a similar question to what we talked about a couple of slides ago.
I should clarify, it's 30 percentage points. So if proficiency for white students was 60%, then we'd expect 30% proficiency for African-American students. And actually the numbers are lower than that, but that's the way we read those numbers. Good clarifying question there. So now we turn our attention to the statewide data. What do we see outside of Milwaukee? And what we see outstate is that students in the parental choice program, so we're talking about WPCP and RPCP here, do significantly better in ELA compared to their peers. We also found about a 4% gap this year that sort of similar across the board with Milwaukee, oddly enough, which hasn't always been the case. We did not see a proficiency gap in math. And going back in our apples to apples report, what we've seen over the years with the statewide program, at first we didn't see any proficiency difference at all statewide in either subject. The last couple of years we've seen this proficiency advantage in ELA, and the pattern has been there's not been a proficiency advantage in math. I'd have to leave it up to folks who are closer to the ground and in schools to know why that's the case, or if this is something that should be focused on more. But we did see the proficiency advantage again for ELA there. Statewide, we did see an advantage for district charters, significantly better in English compared to their public school kids or peers. But curiously, we actually saw a negative effect, and this is the first time we've seen a negative effect for any of our choice or charter programs that was statistically significant. There was a statistically significantly lower math score for students in those schools, though I will note it's relatively small at about 2%, so it's not a huge difference. And we'll have to see going forward if that continues to be the case, or if this is some sort of a COVID aberration. That's something to definitely.
Yeah, and again, I'll just reiterate what I think is just a really important question as we think about what our education policy looks like at the state moving forward post the COVID pandemic. How are we determining how our students are actually doing on the ground? And by using the state exam data, that's one aspect of it, but are we really looking at a comprehensive view of how our students are learning and whether they're proficient in these subjects? I think this is a really ongoing and important conversation that Wisconsin needs to keep having.
Absolutely. So I mentioned that we did see similar achievement gaps statewide, and the low income achievement gap was actually even larger statewide than it was in Milwaukee. And what we see there is 43 to 46% lower proficiency for that hypothetical school with 100% low income kids. And we see slightly smaller achievement gaps for African American and Hispanic students. So again, we're still talking about big gaps, 14 to 15% for 14 to 15% for African American, 4 to 10% for Hispanic. The range there is on the math and the ELA. There was a little variation there. And as I mentioned earlier, the participation rate was less of a problem, so we didn't have to go through that mediation analysis statewide that we did with the Milwaukee data. So just a few other things that we looked at in this report, and this chart is kind of busy looking, but what you see here is every school in the state of Wisconsin that had data, which is the vast majority of schools. And this is public schools only on the right-hand side here, and the relationship between spending and student proficiency. And what you can see here is that this is a very flat line. What we see is that there really doesn't appear to be much of a relationship between spending and proficiency in the state of Wisconsin. In fact, what we see to some extent is that when we get to the middle portion and the higher portion, there are some schools that are very high spending and have very low proficiency. Obviously, there's always going to be a spread. But this is important implications as we think about what we need to be spending on schools in the state. The narrative is pretty continuous that we need to be spending more. We need to be spending more. And with the tremendous amount of money that's coming into schools from things like ARPA going forward, I think getting this data out to folks more at least would arm them with the ability to question more effectively whether more spending is actually the problem. And this is consistent with what we see in national data as well. There's a little relationship between spending and proficiency. If there is, it's things like targeted spending. It's making sure that this money is going to actually work on problem areas. So we see these huge achievement gaps. Maybe some funding there could make a difference, but what we don't need to be doing is sort of across the board spending increases. We have another large project that we're working on, which is focused on equalizing funding between school districts. So you see the spread. We have school districts that are as low as $10,000, and we have some school districts on the upper end that are spending almost $25,000 per student. what we tend to suggest is that we should work on bringing these together to some extent, as well as equalizing funding for our choice and charter schools, which the data tends to be showing are doing a more effective job, at least on a per dollar basis, certainly.
So Flanders, I'm going to jump in there. Two things to say. I was just going to reiterate for all of our listeners that you can't have choice and charter schools on this chart because they both get less than $10,000 per student. So they don't even meet the floor for what our public school students have. And then secondly, I want you to clarify, this does not include federal dollars, right? In this exchange, this is only state and local dollars. Is that correct?
Right. Good clarification. This is just state and local spending. Federal money brings this number up even further. The reason we tend not to focus on that is there's less ability at the state level, as a state think tank, to control federal spending. But yes, even more money is going into schools than what's pictured here. This is what's known as the revenue limit amount. There's also other aids and other programs that are on top of this. So this is sort of the minimum level of spending that we see in schools rather than the maximum.
And then could you just address the enrollment district size point as well?
Yeah, so this is a question that's been brought up in recent months. Do we see smaller school districts doing better? And that, there's been some arguments for consolidation and maybe breaking up, MPS. What we see in Milwaukee is we don't see much, or excuse me, what we see in Wisconsin is we don't see much evidence that smaller districts do better. If anything, we saw a very small effect on the other direction where slightly larger districts were doing better. It's a minuscule effect. But we didn't see much evidence in this state that smaller districts are more effective. You can make an argument that it's sort of intuitive, but we can't back that up with the analysis we have here. We didn't see evidence that smaller districts are somehow more effective just on their surface. There are other factors like low income status, like the sort of demographics of the district that tend to matter a lot more than anything to do with the pure size of the district. So I think what can we use from this analysis going forward? And I'll allow Libby to sort of jump in, here as well. But I think what we need to be doing, what this data shows, is that our choice and charter schools tend to be doing well. And they offer, competition and alternatives for students in areas that may be suffering, that may have these large achievement gaps. But what we know is there's not universal access. We know that there's not the ability for every kid in the state to take advantage of them. Again, we mentioned the income limits earlier. For those that are making just over the 300% of the poverty line in Milwaukee, or those that are over 220, in other parts of the state, paying for private school tuition isn't something that's in the budget of most middle-class families, particularly as we've seen inflation, just explode in recent months and years. So removing those income limits, I think would work to increase access and make sure everyone has the options that are best for them. It's also important to note that the enrollment periods that don't allow interested families to take advantage of it, there's a myriad of complexities in the choice program that make it difficult for families to access. So you have to prove your income, you have to prove you're poor enough, then you have to make sure you're in the proper enrollment window. We think an enrollment system that works more like public schools, or at least wider windows, so that it's not as challenging for folks to meet the windows and get into a choice school, is something that would absolutely be helpful going forward and allow more folks to take advantage of it. And again, I kind of alluded to this, but the admissions process is very complex. Simplifying that so it's maybe one form, maybe even an opt-in process would definitely make it easier for folks to participate, as would getting rid of the income caps, right? The income issues are one of the biggest reasons we see families rejected from choice. They might be just over the income threshold and then they're out of the program. So all of this works together. All of these things simultaneously will work to increase access. Secondly, on the screen here, making sure the report card is reliable. So in addition to what we mentioned about the report card sort of changing the point where a student or where a school qualifies as proficient, or excuse me, as meeting expectations, we saw some other changes to the report card as well. One thing to note is another reason a district like Milwaukee can meet proficiency standards is because they're not really judged on their proficiency at all. They're judged almost entirely. 90% of their proficiency score or their achievement score is based on growth. So that's how much is a student improving. Growth is important, but we tend to think we've overweighted growth in the state report card and underweighted proficiency. No matter what, if you have a school with under 10% proficiency, which we do have in Milwaukee and other parts of the state, that school shouldn't be meeting expectations no matter how much growth they're having. You eventually have to get kids to a point where they can meet expectations and achieve. So we think a reweighting of the way that works would be beneficial going forward.
I'll also jump in, Flanders, and just note that we have similar reliable information issues with our choice schools, right? So our choice school data, and you touched on this earlier, even though you could have kids enrolled in the voucher program that would meet the requirement of low income, it's a separate determination for the report card. And so, and this actually isn't just a voucher program challenge. Public schools and charter districts, or excuse me, public charter schools have also referenced that this is a challenge of how do we balance and identify what students is low income for our state report card. And what we know from the choice program is it's very uncomfortable for parents to prove that they're poor. And so it's not a surprise to us from a data standpoint that it's hard to determine the true level of students that are low income in a school. And with changes to the national lunch programs, this data has become very, very difficult to navigate and has definitely been kind of messing up how the DPI report card is crafted, because you will often see a choice school that has several kids in the program have 0% low income students, which we just know can't be true. And so that's an ongoing challenge. I think that also will impact our report cards moving forward.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, it's a problem for public schools as well. I live in Cudahy, and the percent low income went through some dramatic changes over the past years. It went from 40% to over 70%, then back to 40%. So clearly there's some mismeasurement going on. And you talk to anyone involved in schools, as we have no doubt some folks on the call that know this stuff very well. It's difficult across the board, and we need some adjustments to make sure we're getting accurate data, because it does impact how schools are judged. A couple other things to note here: creating greater transparency so families know what options are available to them. Even though the Milwaukee program has been around for 30 years, we talk to parents and families all the time that don't even know that the choice program exists. So it doesn't help when we have a DPI that tends to fight the choice program at every turn. So getting the information out there remains important, and making sure families know these options do exist, and you don't have to just stick to your assigned district school, not just with the choice program, but with things like open enrollment and charter school options that are out there as well. And then improving the school finance system so that people are able to attend the school of their choice with a sort of equal level of funding. Again, we've discussed this earlier. Choice schools can't even appear on that graph that starts at 10,000 because they're all funded at 8,800 or less. Charter schools are funded in the $9,000 range. And then we do have huge disparities even within our public school side, where we see districts that are at 20,000 and districts that are at 10,000. Bringing all of these numbers together, ideally to the same amount, but even to just a closer together amount, would be beneficial in the long run, so that every child is funded at the same amount no matter which school door they walk into. And with that, we'll see if we have any other folks that are interested in asking a question.
So Flanders, we got a really interesting question. Thomas Storwell's 2020 book on charter schools presents data that shows charter schools close the racial and economic gaps. The book cited data from Milwaukee. Can you address this?
Absolutely. No, that is a very important finding. And you see it in the data here, right? What we don't have is student level data. So it's a little more challenging for us to make assumptions about the individual results for students. But what we see in the data here is that, even accounting for student characteristics, we see this big advantage, this significant advantage anyway, for our charter schools in Milwaukee and statewide. So that strong evidence, there's good student level data that shows that charter schools are great at closing the achievement gap. I think when you visit some of these schools that are sort of laser focused on helping particular groups of students, I think you can see why that could be the case. I think of Howard Fuller's school, which is focused on getting every kid into a university, and many other schools as well throughout the city and the state that are lending credence to that data. So that is a good data point that's been very helpful, and it's comprehensive, shown across the country.
And I'm just going to expand on one of the points you made. So when we use the data available for your apples to apples analysis, we are using the state level data, which is just student proficiency in those kind of 4 buckets. advanced, proficient, basic, and not proficient. Do I have that right?
Oh, yeah, you got it.
Yeah, so we don't have access to an individual student's characteristics and individual students' data performance. The state had made that data available when the choice program started in Milwaukee to our friends at the University of Arkansas. And there has been a lot of really great studies on understanding the impact of the choice program on students' achievement by actually comparing individual student data to their public school peers on a student level data. As an organization that's used to using the public data from DPI, we don't get access to that individual data.
Yep, I've tried before, but curiously, DPI doesn't seem wanting to want to provide that to me. So,
so Flanders, you have another question. When we look beyond student and school performance, could we explore down the road with a view towards finance, charter and private school access to public funds for facilities? So this is speaking to my heart. Yes, we would be very supportive of the idea of our school funding formula being more responsive to what the actual needs are for both individual students and school sectors. Wisconsin does not have a facility funding part of our very complex school funding formula. Many states have an additional funding stream for facilities that is added on top of their normal stream for students. And that makes a really big difference for facilities, because often you have to be dependent on either philanthropic dollars. If you're a private school or a charter school, or if you're a traditional school district, you can go to referenda and raise local property taxes for buildings. So you have a couple more questions. School choice opposition say that the school choice takes the cream of the crop out of public schools like MPS, therefore reducing test scores. How do you react to that? I'm gonna give that one to Flanders.
Yeah, this is a continual critique that we've sort of faced for many years. I think this is where, again, you were talking about the studies from University of Arkansas. This is where we can rely on some of the studies that have been able to have these student level comparisons, not just in Milwaukee, but around the country in places like the DC scholarship program. What you see is that you'll not only compare public school students to their private school choice peers, but sometimes you'll have a lottery system in place where some students win the lottery, and unfortunately some other students lose the lottery, and only the students who win the lottery get to take advantage of the choice program. And what we've seen in a lot of those studies, there are a couple exceptions. It's worth noting Louisiana's program has kind of been an exception to this, but the vast majority of studies that have had this essentially randomized control experimental model have found that choice and charters, or choice kids in this case, tend to do better overall. Again, there are exceptions. There's some that find no effect. There's some, particularly in Louisiana, that have found a negative effect. But we were at 14 out of 16 studies a couple of years ago. Last time I looked, that found at least some positive effect. And I think there have been a couple in the last few years that maybe have even added to that. So I think, it is important to note that it's an affirmative choice when a parent chooses to send their kids to a private school, and some parents may not make that decision, or may not may not know about the possibility. But we can rely on those studies to sort of back up what we're seeing here, that there is a performance advantage that's not just a result of parental interest.
And I'll just note that some of the studies actually looked at Milwaukee data. So we've actually seen that data specifically for Milwaukee students. So another question that came up is, charter schools in Wisconsin operate under substantially reduced regulatory and state imposed financial burden. Why is there a continued emphasis on raising the funding to charter schools? So I'm happy to start this, and I'll kick it over to Flanders. We really believe, as sort of a founding principle for funding, that a student's value shouldn't change based on the school door she walks through. So in the city of Milwaukee, a student could walk down the street and pass a voucher school, a independent district charter school, or independent charter school, or a district school, and her value would change just by the door she walked through. It wouldn't be reflective of her needs. It wouldn't be reflective of her characteristics that might impact her funding, just based off the door she walks through. And we think that's a really archaic way of looking at school funding. Funding should be responsive to the student's needs, whether she's low income, has disabilities, comes from a background that we know could be challenging, like English language learners. Those things we know require more funding in a way that a student without those needs don't have. And so I'd say from the first standpoint is we think the fact that we have such a vast disparity of funding from the lowest end of the voucher programs to the highest end of our traditional public schools is really a detriment to how we fund our students, because it's not reflective of their needs. It's really based off of the school they attend. And the second thing I'll say, and happy to send some additional information, our charter schools are highly regulated. They have to meet all the same state and federal regulations in terms of student safety data, student test data. They can't pick and choose their students. So that's a conversation we'd be happy to have another day. We've done some work on our website on that at www.will-law.org. But to answer the question, we just really believe that funding should be reflective of the student and not the school.
Yeah, I think Libby, you've covered it pretty well. I think that is sort of just our principle here, is that we should equalize funding across the board. I think it's also worth noting that from the funding for district charters, right, there's a skim to the district that's taken off the top, so that should cover sort of bureaucratic costs and things like that that are and we think the skim is quite substantial and maybe larger than it should be even. So I think that really covers it. We really think the value of students shouldn't change based on the school door they walk through. And while there are differences and nuances that have to be considered, I think that's an overarching goal and a guiding principle as we move forward.
So another question is any idea why proficiency rates among choice and charter statewide are better than proficiency rates among choice and charter in Milwaukee? Is that because Milwaukee has more low-income students?
It's a good question. I think you hit the nail on the head there. The demographics and the issues in Milwaukee are across the spectrum, right? The issues we have here touch our choice and charter kids, or choice and charter schools, to a similar way that they touch the public school, right? It's a different population of students, and I think that's why you probably see those proficiency differences. Absolutely, is because of the sort of same demographic factors we've discussed here. While we do see choice and charter schools doing a better job addressing them, we can't fully overcome some of the deficits, and particularly in the larger cities.
And then I believe this is our last question. What is the prospect of fully funding K-4? It is incomprehensible with the research, which demonstrates the importance of early childhood learning, that we choose to fund some of our youngest kids the least. And so I think that's a really good question. It kind of goes back to the same concept of how our funding system is structured, and that we have not updated our system to be reflective of all the various changes of when kids are entering the educational sort of system compared to maybe what it looked like 30, 40 years ago. Flanders, do you have anything you want to add there?
Absolutely. This is an area of interest to us, though I will say it's not an area that we've done the most comprehensive research on as yet. But we're definitely open to the narratives we're discussing today, funding every kid equally. We definitely would be interested in exploring that more as a concept going forward, because it absolutely is the most important to get kids off to a good start for sure.
Yeah, and I'll just end. I think one of the challenges we've seen from a political perspective on those questions is it's seen as just dumping more money into a system that is perceived to have a lot of money. And so that's why when we talk about school finance reform and really wanting it to be reflective of the child and of real-time challenges of what those children are going in, are they actually enrolled? When are they entering the system? Our system is just incapable under its current format to really be reflective of any of those issues. So I want to be mindful of time. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Flanders, do you want to just give a quick highlight of maybe what's to come on some of our school funding stuff, just because there was a lot of questions around that?
Absolutely. So we'll have a few reports coming out in the coming months. We have a report that's looking at the way we fund kids that are no longer in the system. So we call this, for now we're calling it ghost kids, but there's some messaging issues around that. We have a report looking at that. And then we have a report looking at how some states around the country, including Tennessee and Indiana, have reformed their funding system pretty substantially as we look for models going forward. So those will be the next couple things you'll see from us. And then we'll have some stuff focused on choice and charter schools in the later part of the year as well, trying to equalize funding for those school systems. And I'll also just note, if anyone has any further questions, something didn't get answered, feel free to email me. It's my last name, Flanders, at will-law.org. So happy to discuss things further with anyone who has further questions.
And I just put Will's email in our chat, as well as a link to our website. Again, we are a 501c3 nonprofit, and so we exist on just generous donations from our friends. And so if learning more about what Will does or how you can support our work, please go to our website or feel free to contact us. Again, thank you for all of you who are attended. We really enjoyed this robust discussion, and we look forward to joining you next time.